After Franz Kafka's death from tuberculosis in 1924, a letter was discovered inside of his desk in Prague, addressed to his friend, Max Brod. It read, "Dearest Max, my last request. Everything I leave behind me, in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters, my own and others, sketches, and so on, is to be burned, unread." Brod, of course, ignored this request. However, while Kafka mentions all his literary works, he also brings attention to his sketches. Everyone knows Kafka the writer. Few know Kafka the artist. That's because up until very recently, only a few of his drawings were ever widely published. On the covers of these paperbacks from the 1950s, we see three black figures. These anxious figures adorn editions of The Judgment, America, and The Trial. Although the covers are drawn by Kafka, it's hard to know if he would have approved of them. Franz Kafka is known for his stories about alienation, absurd scenarios, and bureaucracies gone bad. If you want to get an idea of what he's about very quickly, I recommend The Onion's video, Prague's Kafka International, named Most Alienating Airport. However, if you come away from that video thinking Kafka is just about randomness or confusion, think again. He is much more than that. What he represents to me now is the power of absurdity, the fight against futility, and the fragmentary nature of existence. Franz Kafka knew the importance of imagery, and his books are filled with rich visual descriptions. In America, he describes the look of the hotel the main character works for. He describes its elevators, its rooms, the photographs in these rooms. In The Trial, he describes the dark Gothic interior of a cathedral in great detail. He describes a painter named Tintorelli, a composite of various figures of the Italian Renaissance: Titian, Tintoretto, and Signorelli or Botticelli. He describes his paintings: a portrait of a judge, a painting of Lady Justice clumsily mixed with the Goddess of Victory, and three nearly identical heath landscapes. Throughout The Castle, Kafka's last novel, he describes a village blanketed in snow during a long winter. When Kafka published his most famous story, Metamorphosis, in which a salesman wakes up one morning to see himself turned into some sort of giant insect, Kafka insisted that the illustrator could not draw the insect itself. It could not even be shown from a distance. Instead, he suggested the parents and the head clerk in front of the locked door, or even better, the parents and sister in the lighted room, with the door open upon the adjoining room that lies in darkness, which resulted in this cover. With all this attention to visual detail, it should be no surprise that Kafka also drew. But besides a small collection of sketches, most of his drawings were unknown to the world, and were quite literally locked away. The reason for this is because these drawings remained the private property of Max Brod's heir, Ilse Esterhofe, until her death. Once she died at the age of 101, a 10-year legal battle ensued, which ended when the Supreme Court of Israel entrusted the papers to the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. So now we can view these drawings, in various states of preservation. Much of the information in this video comes from Franz Kafka, The Drawings, edited by Andreas Kilscher, which I would recommend if you want to see more of Kafka's art. While reading Kafka's novels and short stories in preparation, I was hoping there would be illustrations that were directly tied to his writing. But unfortunately, up until 1907, the vast majority are unrelated to his writing. For one thing, most of them were made during his years as a student. Some are doodles in the margins of lecture notes, like this drawing of passengers on the deck of a ship looking out at an ocean liner, or on the back of notes from his legal studies, like this detailed house, or doodles on publications, like how he added 10 figures to the page of this satirical magazine. 2 of them accompany the jester in mocking the cage victims. Before dismissing all of these as unskilled scribblings, however, some additional context may be needed. Kafka was interested in art history and studied it for a time, with an admiration for Japanese woodblock prints. He took drawing lessons and wrote about them in a letter. "I was once a great draftsman, you know. But then I started to take academic drawing lessons with a bad woman painter, and ruined my talent. As we can see from these, he was capable of naturalism. It seems these childlike sketches come from deliberate choice rather than a lack of ability, if I were to be charitable at least. This drawing of a figure either running in full sprint or preparing to jump is executed with only a few highly gestural strokes. Its minimalism is evocative of the calligraphic style of traditional Chinese and Japanese paintings. The aerodynamic curves and expertly dynamic line weight is especially pleasing. This economy of line and flowing pose is not easy to execute as an unskilled draftsman. This drawing of some sort of penis creature, drawn on packaging paper, could clearly only be conceived and executed by a skilled genius. In all seriousness, when it comes to people that everyone seems to agree were geniuses, there is a temptation to automatically praise everything they've ever done. I don't intend to do that here, though I am certainly pushed to give more benefit of the doubt to these sketches than I would to the average person's. I don't mean to give more weight and significance to drawings that are clearly loose doodles than is deserved. Like with most artists, I think Kafka has a few great drawings, many average ones, and some I think are just plain bad. This drawing of a full scene, which he gave the title Haughtiness of Wealth, is one of his best. It is simultaneously silly and grotesque. Two servants trot along with flailing limbs. One might be holding a tray containing an orchestra. The other carries a tray with some fantastical bird. They carry them, with ample pomp and circumstance, to some high-class women in ridiculous outfits. On this page, we get two views of people carrying a box, likely a sedan chair, through a landscape. There's nothing too special about it, except that it's a rare case of Kafka drawing the same scene in a different perspective on the same page, as if the top is an establishing shot and the bottom is a zoom-in, in which they are carrying the box to the man resting next to the tree. Read like this, it acts as a comic or a storyboard. This work is intriguing but flawed. There is a problem of readability with it. It looks like complete insanity at first glance, but with a bit of concentration, you see a man riding some sort of incomprehensible beast. The man brandishes a pistol, and the two are terrorizing a local population. While most of this is distinguishable, some drawings are just random nonsense scribbling. Some of these sketches are childlike, and have a sense of humor that is not uncharacteristic of Kafka's writing. On this page, I can only see a figure that looks like an Adventure Time wizard, and a disfigured man peering at him from the corner. With these figures, it's again hard to tell what is happening at first glance, but with a bit of concentration, we can see this left figure, which looks like a Dr. Seuss Who, is putting a hand on their puffed up chest, while they wear a strange Christmas tree-like hat. The right figure, with wavy legs, is holding their hat in front of their very tall body. On this page, which has been partially cut off, we see a man who looks like a salt shaker walking a dog which wears tiny, fancy shoes. Kafka seemed to have a fascination with men in suits, and especially shoes, in his figure drawings. Or as Andreas puts it, he pays more attention to shoes than to faces. This woman, then, must be the pepper shaker. She may be wearing a folk costume, and she holds a platter of unidentifiable items. The figure on the right is just as unexplainable. This drawing looks like the figure from Edvard Munch's The Scream, now calm, sitting politely next to Van Gogh's Postman. Both paintings were possible to view in Kafka's lifetime. These two are some of my favorites. This pair of distorted men show polar opposite emotions in the extreme. The first man skips along with fashionable polished shoes, his knee so raised that it enlarges, his head so high in the clouds it is detached from his body. The second man's spirit is crushed by some mysterious force. He is physically smaller in size, and his entire body curves to keep him looking down. His hands rest shamefully in his pockets. In these drawings, we can see more of Kafka's naturalism. At the top is a portrait of his mother, Julie Kafka, and below is his self-portrait. Kafka's recognizable face and intense, thoughtful stare meets ours. The way Kafka illustrates his mother's gentle gaze upon his self-portrait may reveal a preference for his mother over his father, whom Kafka famously feared. Kilscher's book titles these three self-portraits, though to me I can't see the resemblance to Kafka's face in them except for their intense stares. The first emphasizes the light source, and the face is drawn from further away. The second is focused on the anatomical details in a close-up, and the last one is drawn with his eyes bulging out, making him look especially unhinged. Each of them have parts of their body or face disappearing into the white of the page. When we talk of Kafka and alienation, most people go to his novella, Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman, wakes up as a giant insect or vermin, only to worry that he will not catch the train to make it to work on time. Everybody knows the first third of the story. The next 2/3 that people are less familiar with are about Gregor slowly getting used to his new body, how he climbs on the walls and ceiling, how his sister prepares meals of scrap for him, and how the family he once financially supported slowly grows to resent his burdensome presence, as if it was his fault he turned into an insect. Literally, it's both a comical and a disturbing supernatural tale. Metaphorically, it's the telling of someone filled with guilt, turned into someone who cannot help but stay in his room and waste away. Someone we might recognize today as a hikikomori. Tragically, Gregor still has the awareness to realize how disgusting he's become. In Kafka's short story, A Report to an Academy, the inverse of this premise is explored. An ape, captured from the Gold Coast, overcomes his wild animal tendencies and learns to behave like a human. In the lower decks of the ship, the ape, nicknamed Red Peter, learns to drink and speak to escape his cage, and later integrate into human society. He even gets an ape girlfriend.
Try the bananas, darling. They're dashing.
Red Peter does not act like a human because he wants to. He does it because it was the only way out. Neither of these stories have a cheery view of humanity, but they don't cast it in complete darkness either. Gregor's sister seems to show genuine kindness to him, at least for a time, when no one else will. The crew of the ape ship are patient and somewhat accommodating. As Red Peter reports, they were good people, despite everything. Kafka's drawing output decreased significantly once he started to focus more on writing, but he never stopped completely. After 1908, his drawings began to have more of a relationship with his writing. Kilscher claims that Kafka's style was most impacted by his contemporaries and artists, Alfred Kubin and Max Horb. Alfred Kubin made all kinds of surreal and grotesque illustrations, which are so nightmarish and unique I think they deserve their own video. Max Horb made caricatures, and he lived such a short life and painted so few pictures that it's difficult to find many examples of his work. Franz Kafka did not in fact draw exclusively on scrap pieces of paper, but at one point drew in a sketchbook. From this sketchbook, we get some of Kafka's most refined drawings. Here we can see a figure, legs firmly planted on an invisible ground, making some sort of potion. The positioning of his arms suggests he is casting a spell on the brew. Here we see a distorted man, some sort of bookworm, wielding a sword, maybe a small caricature of someone Kafka knew. Unfortunately, the silliness stops here. What comes next are the kinds of drawings you would more expect when you hear the term Kafkaesque. They're also some of his most confidently designed. Max Brod recognized their quality, and, probably to the chagrin of Kafka historians, cut them out of Kafka's sketchbook to show and publish. While these 6 have been published and even used on book covers, these 4 have never been published until recently. This sitting figure is probably part of the same series, and is an expressive and elegantly designed silhouette. If Kafka was told to design emojis, these figures feel like they would be the result. Ah yes, the primary emotions. Despair, confusion, longing, exhaustion, fencing, recognition of self, and contemplation. This collection of little guys, if nothing more than doodling, have come to represent the tone and atmosphere of much of Kafka's writing in visual form. However, you cannot simplify Kafka's work to a small collection of emotions like despair or exhaustion. Kafka's drawings can be genuinely strange, Not strange in a way where it seems like someone is trying to be strange, but strange in a way that comes completely naturally. A strangeness that seems to come from a dream. Like this bearded man who is all legs. Or this armless figure with a mask-like face, stomping forward on mismatched feet. There is a chaotic lightness to these figures. A taste of Joan Miro can be detected. Or take this raging figure, lunging at a fully black glass. Considering the flatness and lack of detail in his other drawings, I wonder what in God's name compelled Kafka to give this glass a shadow. This ability to be truly strange is one of Kafka's merits. Many of his short stories sound like mistranslated parables, disconnected from a culture and a time where everything about them would make sense and their meanings would be obvious, and plopped into our culture and present where they only make sense half of the time and their meanings require intense decoding and contemplation. The dreamlike nature of Kafka's strangeness is highlighted in his most famous novel, The Trial. I think everyone in the West has heard the premise of The Trial in some form or another, even if they don't know where it comes from. A man is arrested, and he is never told for what crime. The Trial, or Der Prozess, explores this premise through Joseph K., a bank clerk who must navigate an incredibly corrupt, incredibly opaque, and surreal court system that seems to exist somehow separate from regular society and also secretly intertwined within it. Their offices are everywhere, and so are their agents. Kay tries to defend himself in many ways through many characters, but to no avail. Eventually, he happens upon a priest in a cathedral who tells him the story before the law. A doorkeeper stands before the law. A man from the country comes to this doorkeeper and asks to be admitted to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot grant him entry now. The man then asks if he will be allowed to enter later. "It's possible," says the doorkeeper, "but not now." Since the gate to the law is open as always, and the doorkeeper steps aside, the man bends down to look through the gate into the interior. When the doorkeeper notices, he laughs and says, "If it attracts you so much, have a try despite my prohibition. Take note though, I'm powerful, and I'm only the lowest doorkeeper. From one hall to the next, however, there are doorkeepers each more powerful than the last. Not even I can bear the sight of the third one." The man decides to wait until he gets permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit to one side of the door. He sits there for days and years. He makes many attempts to be admitted and tries the doorkeeper out with his pleas. But it always ends with the doorkeeper telling him that he can't admit him yet. He curses this bad fortune loudly in the early years. Later, as he grows old, he just grumbles to himself. Before his death, all the experiences of the whole time accumulate in his head to form a question that he hasn't yet asked the doorkeeper. "All of us strive for the law," says the man. "How is it, then, that in all these years, no one but me has asked for admission?" The doorkeeper realizes that the man is already at his end, and in order to compensate for his failing hearing, he roars at him. "No one else could gain entry here, because this entrance was intended only for you. I will now go and close it." This is an abridged version of the story. In the book it is more detailed, but most of the important information is here. It seems like this story would make perfect sense in a dream, but in the conscious world, it seems to be the tale of a contradictory doorkeeper. In the book, this story is followed by an analysis / back and forth between Joseph K. and the priest on the story's meaning. But reading it might make you feel more frustrated than before you read the analysis. My interpretation is that the doorkeeper must have been waiting for a signal, from the law, or from the man, or from something. But the signal never came. Just because an entrance was intended for someone doesn't mean the guard of that entrance couldn't wait for the proper time or proper signal from a higher authority to let them in. If you reserve a table at a restaurant, they might still make you wait. But that interpretation seems too literal, too simple, too bound to the logic of the real world. I've thought about this tale more than any other short story I've ever read before, and I still don't think I'm smart enough to grasp its full significance. In the context of the trial, Before the Law just seems like a summary of the trial. Joseph K. is the man from the country. There was nothing either of them could have done to get what they wanted through the proper channels. If I were K, I would have forgotten the whole try to gain access to the court nonsense and had kept a knife on me wherever I went. If I were the man from the country, I would have run in while the doorkeeper wasn't paying attention. But even going through these improper channels would be futile as well. What good is a life lived in fear? And if I ran in, I would just find myself face to face with another doorkeeper.
In 1911, Kafka kept a travel diary during his trip from Munich to Paris with Max Brod. Through this diary, Kafka started to use drawing to represent things he was observing, such as this diagram of a roulette table at a casino hotel he stayed at, or this church tower in Osteno, Italy, and this house in Weimar, Germany, probably the most detailed drawing of a real-life subject Kafka ever made. In one letter, Kafka made a diagram to show how he held hands with a lover while on a walk in a dream. In another, Kafka illustrated scenes of his daily routine spa treatment for tuberculosis. At this point, it is obvious he has begun to use drawing as a means to give his writing an extra dimension. This drawing of a gruesome execution method is also contained within the letter. It should not surprise you by now that this is not the only execution machine Kafka ever described. In his short story, In the Penal Colony, an officer of the colony shows a traveler a machine that is designed to execute a condemned man by writing their sentence on their body over and over again, for hours, until death. In this torture execution, a man is pulled apart by poles as the inventor stands from afar, observing calmly. White space occupies where the man's gory organs would be. For an execution scene, the lines are surprisingly light and airy, as if Kafka was just doodling a cartoon instead of explaining in visual form a horrid fate. Throughout Kafka's diaries and notebooks, we get more drawings that are directly related to his writing. This drawing and passage are inspired by Japanese equilibrists he saw at a performance. In the equilibrist show, one man lays on his back and uses his feet to balance a ladder, while at the very top rung, another man stands and performs his feats. Next to this, observing the act, is a crowd of just the worst faces drawn in profile I've ever seen. The significance of this act is revealed in the text. My condition is not unhappiness, but it is also not happiness, not indifference, not weakness, not fatigue, not another interest. So what is it then? That I do not know this is probably connected with my inability to write. Kafka goes on to write that his ideas, these things that occur to him, are hard to grasp, and that only people like Japanese jugglers could. He gives the example of this ladder act. I cannot do this, aside from the fact that my ladder does not even have those souls at its disposal. Last Christmas, when I was so far gone that I was barely able to control myself, and when I seemed really on the last rung of my ladder, which, however, rested quietly on the ground and against a wall. But what ground? What a wall. And yet that ladder did not fall. So strongly did my feet press it against the ground. So strongly did my feet raise it against the wall. I think there's something beautiful about this image and passage. How Kafka describes someone fighting against something insurmountable. How this acrobat is controlling this chaos, this self-imposed absurdity, trying with all their might and succeeding, even if just for a moment, to prevent it all from tumbling down. This drawing depicts a curvy gate with a doorkeeper and two figures attempting to enter. The text above ends with, "We are outside the law. No one knows it, and yet everyone treats us accordingly." If that sounds familiar, this could be an early fragment of an idea for his short story, Before the Law, which would be written several years later, and which would go on to be included in The Trial. This sketch of a woman's head has similarities to a photograph of Dora Diamant, who was Kafka's last lover, though this visual connection has not been confirmed. It is a gentle drawing, free of harsh angles, strong pencil lines, and the deep blacks of his other works. It is sketched on the back of a draft of Josephine the Singer, or The Mousefolk, which was Kafka's last story. Meaning, it might have been Kafka's last drawing. We never learn what Joseph K. was arrested for in the trial. We never learn who his accusers are, and almost none of the authorities in this evil system are ever punished. There is no backstory for why this system exists. No big bad villain that benefits from it is ever revealed. Kafka also never finished the novel, though he did write the ending. If Before the Law is like a dream, then the whole of The Trial is like a nightmare. There is a strong atmosphere of looming doom over the entire story. So it's immensely fitting that you can be deep into reading a chapter, and then out of nowhere it says, "Block," said Lenny in a cautionary tone, pulling him up a bit by the jacket collar. "Leave the fur alone now, and listen to the lawyer." This chapter remained unfinished. To live life is to deal with things that are incomplete. Incomplete histories, records, knowledge, and understanding abounds. For all that was saved from Franz Kafka's life after his death, during his life, he still burned so much of his own work. Many of the drawings showcased here don't have the proper context, because that context was literally torn or cut away. I mean, look at how mangled the paper this was drawn on is. There's at least 3 different pieces here that have been cut and then glued and taped back together. Kafka finished none of the 3 novels he started. Before the trial, he started America, a story of a German-speaking immigrant who comes to America and spends the next 300 pages searching for a job. Throughout the journey, he experiences many failures and a few successes, which honestly makes it the most optimistic Kafka novel. The whole book is concerned with finding and maintaining a place of belonging in a world that continually punishes the protagonist, and people in general, for small mistakes. The first chapter of the book was actually published in Kafka's lifetime as The Stoker, with the subtitle, A Fragment. And although the book is about America, Kafka never actually visited. After the trial, he wrote The Castle, a book in which a land surveyor named Kay arrives at a remote village ruled by a castle which houses a mysterious bureaucracy. When he finds out the job he was called for doesn't exist, he tries to navigate this bureaucracy to establish himself anyway. In the book, nothing happens, nothing makes sense, frustration abounds, and by the end of it, you hardly even understand what was the point of it all. To paraphrase the YouTuber Liminal Spaces review of the book, it's like reading a man from one culture clash with the rules and behavior of a completely different culture. In an ordinary story, the protagonist would eventually make it to the castle. In this book, the protagonist doesn't even get to have a conversation with a high official that works in the castle. In the edition I bought, it ends with Kay's fiancé leaving him for another man. Even for an unfinished story by Franz Kafka, that ending really sucks. However, in his manuscripts, the castle ends mid-sentence. She held out her trembling hand to Kay and had him sit down beside her. She spoke with great difficulty. It was difficult to understand her, but what she said... Kafka never wrote official endings for America or the castle, though he did float ideas for how they would end. Still, as they are, they don't exactly lend themselves to being finished. After they begin, they read like an endless middle. Characters move from one location to the next, from one person to another, ceaselessly fighting and descending. The book's protagonists stubbornly try and fail and try again to navigate something which cannot be navigated, not through the proper channels or through improper ones. If these protagonists ever fully succeeded, they would undermine the impenetrable nature of these systems. If at the end all the protagonists fully submitted, that would be fitting, but would probably become repetitive. Kafka constantly doubted himself and his work, and although brilliant, it's like he ended up inventing his own impenetrable style, for which there was no way out. It's possible, with great difficulty, he could have written satisfactory endings, but either because he didn't know how, or he didn't have the motivation, or both, he never did. In 2023, the first uncensored edition of Kafka's diaries was published in English. The Kafka Project is the third attempt to search for missing Kafka letters, notebooks, and sketches written during the last year of his life. They were confiscated by the Gestapo in 1933 and remain lost. You'd think Kafka would be one of those classic writers where everything has been pinned down and fully cataloged by now. But no, things are still being unearthed, and much still remains missing. The only reason we even have any of Kafka's unpublished writings and drawings is because his best friend, Max Brod, refused an order, and an enormous legal battle ruled in favor of letting these materials be published. Here's an amusing excerpt from a New York Times article about the legal battle. "The thing is," Steinberg said, "we only have Brod's word for any of this. What if Kafka never even told him to burn his stuff? Has anyone ever seen that letter? What if this is all some big idea Brod had?" Similarly paranoid thoughts cross the mind of nearly everyone who studies Kafka. At a certain point, you realize that everything, even the picture of Brod as a good-natured busybody who ignored Kafka's wishes, comes from Brod himself. Don't write this down. I don't want to be the laughingstock of the academic community. One scholar told me, having ventured the idea that Brod himself had composed all of Kafka's writings, and, alarmed by their strangeness, attributed them to a reclusive friend who worked at an insurance office. To add the drawings onto that, what could be more Kafkaesque than all of Franz Kafka's work not even being made by Kafka? Or I guess in this case, it would be Brodesque. We can now, of course, view Kafka's letter, but at the time of the legal battle, it's funny to read about the craziness that surrounded Kafka's unpublished works. With all this talk of endings, out of curiosity I searched for Kafka's last words on the internet. The first result is, of course, an AI overview, claiming that his last recorded words were, "Kill me, or else you are a murderer." Supposedly, he is asking his doctor to give him a lethal dose of morphine to relieve him of his pain from laryngeal tuberculosis. I'm suspicious of the veracity of this. For one thing, the sources this overview provides only point to websites that also don't give any credible sources. There seems to be at least one credible source on the internet that says he said this. Though if someone has a primary source for this quote, I would be happy to see it. For another, his last words sound too perfect. They don't seem to make sense on the surface, they seem contradictory in a Kafkaesque way. I'm skeptical. In fact, it seems quotes are misattributed to Kafka frequently. There's a famous story of Kafka trying to help a little girl find a lost doll, and when they can't find it, he writes letters in the voice of the doll to the girl about the doll's adventures. The story was apparently first told by Dora Diamant. I don't mind the story, but without any physical evidence, its truthfulness remains unknown. Isn't it amusing that even Kafka's own life has been mythologized like some ancient king, despite being a 20th century writer, whose city streets he walked down still have the same names? What Kafka means to me is the irrationality of human behavior. Through daily life, we face innumerable mundane absurdities. We use social media to avoid being social. We fill our fridges with food just to let a good percentage of it rot. Many people are using AI to write school reports, cover letters, and resumes, only for AI to evaluate those school reports, cover letters, and resumes. You are then told to work a job, not so that you can enjoy it, not so that you can build something, but so that you can save enough money to one day not work a job. Humans will search for meaning for their whole life, only to inevitably fail and pass that task on to their offspring, who will search for meaning for their whole life, only to inevitably fail
and pass that task on to their offspring, who will search for meaning for their whole life, only to inevitably fail, and pass that task on to their offspring, who will search for meaning for their whole life, only to inevitably fail, and pass that task on to their offspring. Finally, at the very top of it all, as one essay puts it, man is endowed with the instinct of self-preservation, while at the same time facing the certainty of death. It seems to me that absurdity is inherent to all human systems, and, to an extent, the great system of life itself. Once a system becomes big enough and complex enough, cracks will form under the stress of its own weight, and people will eventually be put in impossible situations, and irrationality will arise. It's a hard fact of life that one day you may be randomly punished for no fault of your own. Kafka helps us understand we are not alone in these struggles, and pages of fictional frustration can make us recognize our own frustration. When I first heard that Franz Kafka had made art, and that most of this art was kept a secret, I was excited. When I first viewed his works, I was initially disappointed. Most of them are just fragments, like bits of preparatory sketches that wouldn't have been put under nearly as much scrutiny if they were made by someone who wasn't famous. The black figures I do like, but in the end, they only leave me hungry for what could have been if Kafka had taken drawing a little more seriously. If he, at some point, decided to sit down and draw or even paint a full scene on a proper canvas. If he dared even add color. But then again, considering his short life, self-consciousness, endless neuroticism, and propensity to leave things unfinished, getting deeply involved in another medium would have likely just cut into his writing. We're probably lucky we got what we got. We can only view Franz Kafka's life and works through a broken glass. Fragments of his drawings and writing lay scattered across the earth. We can guess and wonder what would have happened if he had done this or that. But there's no use in wondering what could have been. It was never going to happen in any other way. To think anything else is futile, and yet,
I swear I didn't shoot the mayor.
You are not on trial for shooting the mayor. You are on trial for being on trial.
But I'm innocent.
By proclaiming your innocence, it proves you're on trial.
What sort of law is this?
Laws? Laws are illegal here. Guilty!